Good morning, and glad to have you back. Yesterday we gave an introduction to the frame and made the sidebars. Today we will complete the project by making the top and bottom bars and then assembling the frame. So let's get started in the Beekeeper's Workshop. The top bar, as the name implies, is the topmost piece of the frame. The top bar spans the entire length of the hive and sits on a ledge called the frame rest on the inside of the hive body. There are two different styles of top bars: the grooved, which is used with plastic or Duragilt foundation, and the wedge, which is used with wax foundation. The difference lies in how the foundation is installed in the top bar. With the grooved style, there is a groove centered along the bottom of the top bar. The plastic foundation slides into this groove. With the wedged style, the outside piece which forms this groove is removed. The wax foundation is then placed against the shoulder and is secured with a tack strip that is nailed or stapled in place. Each end of the top bar, the parts that stick out from the side bars, is called the ear. The ear has a few subtle features that we should point out. First, the lower part of the top bar is slightly tapered upward when viewed from the side. Second, the corners of the ears are beveled when viewed from the top. Although the top bar looks a bit complicated, it really isn't too bad. In fact, it is rather satisfying to make. You can make the top bar in a series of 7 simple steps. So let's get started. The rough blank for the top bar is 19 inches long, 1 1/16 of an inch wide, and 3/4 of an inch thick. We will make the top bars out of a 1x6 board. From a 1x6 board, cut several pieces 19 inches long. You will get about 4 top bars from a 1x6, so cut as many blanks as you will need. Then, with a table saw, rip the pieces into blanks 1 1/16 inch wide. Next, we need to cut a groove centered down the length of the workpiece. This groove is at 1/2 inch from the side and 1/4 inch deep. We have raised the blade 1/4 inch and set the saw's fence 1/2 inch from the inside of the blade. Notice that I have marked the outside of the blank. This is the side that will eventually be removed for the tack strip. Now we can run each top bar blank through the saw, making the groove. On both sides of each end, we need to cut a shallow groove or dado 5/8 of an inch from the end. This dado is 3/8 of an inch wide and 3/32 of an inch deep. The critical dimension is a 7/8 inch between the bottoms of the two dados. It is this dimension that matches the width of the top notch on the side bars that we made earlier. Getting the dado blade right for this operation is probably the most demanding setup in this entire project. The dado blade is stacked for a 3/8 inch cut, the same setup we used for the thickness gauge when making the side bars. Notice that I am using a 3/32 inch drill bit to set the height of the blade. The fence is 5/8 of an inch from the inside of the blade. You will definitely want to make a test cut on this setup. One way to test the depth of the cut is to put a 3/32 drill bit in the dado and then span with a straight edge. The drill bit should be snug with no wiggle room. Perhaps a more important check is to take a sidebar and see how it fits in the grooves. Once you are satisfied with the saw setup, continue to cut the dados on the rest of the top bars. Remember, we need these grooves on both ends of the top bar, so flip the blank end for end and repeat the cuts. The next step is to cut another 3/8 inch wide dado on the bottom of the top bar. This dado is also 5/8 of an inch from the end, so do not move the fence position used in the previous step. All you have to do is adjust the height of the dado for a 1/4 inch deep cut. We are lowering the dado blade to a 1/4 inch. And just like we did before, use the miter gauge to keep the blank square to the blade. Slide the end of the workpiece up against the fence and make your cut. Be sure to make the cut on the bottom of the workpiece, the side with the long groove. And make this dado on both ends of the top bar. Now we can turn our attention to making the ears on both ends of the top bar. The top bar ear has a tapered bottom which goes from 7/16 of an inch on the end to 1/2 inch on the outside edge of the bottom dado, a distance of 5/8 of an inch. The tapered ear is quite subtle. If you're uncomfortable in making it, you can certainly live without it. It is, however, a nice feature and worth taking a stab at. We'll show you 2 ways to make the tapered ends, first using a bandsaw and then using a table saw. We find the taper easiest to make with the bandsaw and a taper jig. The taper jig allows us to get the proper angle, and once the bandsaw and taper jig are set up, creating the tapered ear is really quite easy. The secret to this operation is the taper jig set at the proper angle. As mentioned before, the taper goes from 7/16 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch over a distance of 5/8 of an inch. This is a difference of 1/16 of an inch over a length of 5/8 of an inch. Saying the same thing in another way, the taper has a rise over run of 1 to 10. Using this ratio, we can set the spread on the taper jig. Measure 10 inches along the back side of the jig from the hinged end. Then spread the outer arm of the jig so that there is a 1-inch gap between the 2 sides at this point. The jig now has a rise over run of 1 to 10 and will give us the tapered cut that we are looking for. We are now ready to go. Strike a line 7/16 of an inch down from the top of each end of the top bar. This will mark the start of our cut. With the top of the workpiece against the taper jig, position the top bar, jig and all, to start your cut at the mark. Then slide the whole shebang through. The cut should end right at the bottom groove. Of course, do the same thing on the other end as well. There, that's how you make the tapered ends on the bandsaw. You can also make the tapered end using the table saw. To do this, the saw's blade will be tilted about 5 degrees and the top bar will be held vertically against the fence. The only safe way to make this type of cut is using a tenon jig. On the back of the tenon jig, install a stop. I used a 1-inch strip of 1/4 inch hardboard. Then rotate the saw's blade 5 degrees. Next, adjust the blade to a height of 5/8 of an inch and move the fence to 7/16 of an inch between the tenon jig and the bottom of the blade. Securely clamp the top bar against the tenon jig with the bottom facing out and make your cut. And of course, flip the top bar end for end and cut the taper on the other ear. And that's how you make the tapered ends on the table saw. Pretty slick. Another subtle feature of the top bar end is the beveled corners. As with the bottom taper, the beveled corners make taking the frames out of the hive a lot easier. The corners of each ear are cut at a 45-degree angle. All you really need to do is soften the corners a bit. A properly cut bevel will result in a face that is a 1/4 inch wide. We will make the beveled corners on the table saw. The bevel requires the blade to be very close to, if not touching, the fence of the saw. So we install a sacrifice board to keep the blade well clear of the metal fence. To get the 1/4 inch bevel with a thin kerf blade on my saw, the blade will just clear the sacrifice board. Your setup may be a bit different. If you have a wider kerf blade, then you may need to lower the blade below the table, move the fence so that the sacrifice board is slightly over the blade, and then raise the blade while the saw is running to make a pocket. Use your miter gauge set to a 45-degree angle. Place the top bar so that it just touches the sacrifice board ahead of the saw blade, and then run it through. You will definitely have to make a few test cuts to find the right spacing for your blade. Again, you are looking for a 1/4 inch face on the bevel. Cut the bevel on both corners of both ends. 4 cuts in total. The final step for the top bar is to make the space for the tack strip. What we are going to do is cut out the piece that forms the rightmost section of the groove, leaving a shoulder that is a 1/2 inch wide and a 1/4 inch high. Tack strips are only used when installing wax foundation. If you are using plastic or Duragilt foundation, you can skip this step. We can now move on to cutting out the tack strip space. To make this cut, we are going to place the top bar with the grooved bottom facing away from the fence, and this is important. The 1/2 inch shoulder should be facing up. Carefully adjust the height of the table saw blade. The blade should just protrude into the groove and not impinge on the shoulder above. And move the fence to 1/2 inch from the inside of the blade. Then make the cut creating the tack strip space. Be sure to use those push sticks. And with that, we are done with the top bar. Compared to the side and top bar, the bottom bar is easy to make. The bottom bar is 17 3/4 inches long, 3/4 inch wide, and 3/8 inch high, and features a 5/16 inch groove centered along the entire length. From a 1x6, cut a piece that is 17 3/4 inches long. We should be able to get about 11 bottom bars from this 1x6. Since we are cutting thin strips that are subject to a kickback, I'm using the drill bit and combo square technique we saw earlier. A 3/8 inch diameter drill bit gets us to where we want to be. The centerline groove on the bottom bar is easy to make. On the table saw, adjust the blade to 5/16 inch height and move the fence so that the blade will run down the center of the workpiece. The middle of the blade will be 3/8 inch from the fence. Run the bottom bar blank through the saw. Notice that only about a 1/16 of an inch of wood will be left at the top of the groove. This is not very much wood, which is why the accuracy is important when setting up the height of the saw blade. Finally, we can make the tack strips. Remember, tack strips are only needed if you are making the wedge-style frames, which are used for wax foundation. If you are making the groove-style frames, which are used for Duragilt and plastic foundation, then you won't need a tack strip and can skip this step. The tack strip is also easy to make. It is 7/16 inch wide, a 1/4 inch high, and 17 inches long. From a 1x6, cut a piece that is 17 inches long. We should be able to get about 14 tack strips from this board, so one piece will go a long way. Like we did with the bottom bar, we now rip the board into thin strips a 1/4 inch wide. This time I'm using a 1/4 inch drill bit for the spacer. Finally, adjust the fence 7/16 of an inch to the inside of the blade. Be sure to hold the tack strip firmly against the table and keep your fingers away from the blade. As always, we are using push sticks to hold the work firmly and safely. And a zero clearance insert is also a good idea. We are homing in on the end of this project and can now move on to assembling the frame. I'm going to assemble the frame freehand, though you might want to consider a frame assembly jig. These jigs are available commercially, or you can search the web for plans to make one yourself. This graphic shows the locations of where we will staple the frame together. A single 1-inch staple going through the top bar and into each of the sidebars is sufficient. Similarly, staple up through each end of the bottom bar into the sidebars. Finally, a 1-inch staple tucked up under the ear on the sidebar and into the top bar will add a bit more strength to the frame. A good job gluing up the joints is the secret to strong frames. Today I am using Gorilla Glue, which is an expandable urethane glue. Because this stuff foams up as it cures, it will fill any small gaps you have in the joints. The glue is also waterproof and very strong. Be sure to use a rafter square and keep the sidebars square to the top bar. This type of urethane glue is water activated, which is why I am spraying the joints before applying the product. By the same token, moisture in the air will also cure the glue, so it is recommended that you squeeze as much air out of the bottle as you can before storing. When taken care of, this stuff has a shelf life of about a year. The bottom bar should fit nicely into the lower grooves of the sidebar, and a single staple in each end is all we need. And be sure to tuck a staple under the ears through the sidebar and up into the top bar. There, job done. Now that you have made a frame, you can go back and really start to crank these babies out. It is a good idea to make more frames than you think you need, because when you need a frame, you need a frame. There simply will not be enough time to go back to the shop and make more. So always have plenty of frames on hand. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope you have enjoyed this project in the Beekeeper's Workshop.